living on a farm. And it was, for Dad, he was this young man, graduated from high school, and he had this dream of going to Wyoming. So he persuaded a friend of his that they were going to take off on the train and head to Wyoming. So he jumped out of the upstairs windows where they were living in their home there in Indiana, and for a long time his footprints they could see on the ground. Didn't tell anybody except for he left a note. And he didn't realize till later it was Mother's Day when he left. It wasn't that he disliked his parents or his mom at all. He just wanted to go, and they were ready. So he and his friend met up, and they hopped on a train. That's when you just jumped on the train and didn't pay anything for it. And they found, one after the other rides to get back to Wyoming. They didn't have hardly any money in their pocket, so they ended up eating, canned pork and beans and that kind of thing. When they got to Belfish, South Dakota, which was close to where Mom and Dad homestead, or his mom and dad homesteaded, about 40 miles away, they didn't know how they were going to get the rest of the way because there was no train that went that far. But they were sitting, he said, on the curb, feeling kind of dejected and worn out, I'm sure, and really not in very good physical condition as far as their cleanliness and all of that. He happened to look across the street and he saw this guy with a big handlebar mustache across the road, older man, and he right away knew who it was. It was John Seeley. And so he immediately, because John lived out in the area where he wanted to go, so he immediately went across the street and told him who he was and just said, can we catch a ride back to your home with you? And John was kind of a grumpy old man. That's his outward appearance anyway. Well, he guessed so, but they'd have to ride in the back of the pickup. And of course, they jumped at the chance, and they rode back, and bless his heart, John Seeley actually gave them work just to get, so they'd have room and board. So, food, they didn't have anything. But John was a good man, so they worked for him, he didn't pay them. It was during those years when there wasn't a lot of money available. Didn't pay them. So, but Dad found, one job after another at different locations and was able to gradually, build up some income. But most often when he worked, he was for room and board. It wasn't a lot of income otherwise because the ranchers back there in Wyoming at that time really didn't have a lot of cash to share. But he was just glad to be there because he wanted to be there and just glad to have a place to stay. So it happened to be one time when, I forget who he was working for at the time, but they were on a ball team. He and some other guys were playing baseball, and they stopped at the Mahoney Ranch. So they were going to play a game, but they were going to eat some food there. And he was stirring up some ice cream, homemade ice cream, churning it, and he looked out from the window and he saw this young woman stick her head out the window, and a thought came to him, she's going to be my wife. And he just poo-pooed it, forgot all about it. But lo and behold, it was not many years afterwards when she was the woman that he married. So, and he thought afterwards how, that was the case. My grandmother was not very happy that her daughter was going to marry this man. He was really kind of a worldly guy. He smoked, and he wasn't a church-going man. Well, my grandmother on my mom's side was a little missionary. She was a member of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Anytime anyone came to their home, she was talking about the church. My mom said she and her 3 brothers, at that time living at home, were embarrassed because she would always talk about the church and they wanted her to be quiet with talking about it. But my grandmother, she was, like I say, a little missionary. So she had this experience, a dream one night, where she and my mom were picking berries out in the woods area. And so she said, "Oh my goodness, Alice, come and look at the berries I found. Come and pick." And my mom says, "Oh no, you need to come over here and see what mine are." And she went over there, and they were even more delicious and bigger and fatter and more of them. So that for my grandmother was a sign that my mom's choice of who she was going to marry was the right one. And that's what happened. My mom and dad got married, and my grandmother kept dropping little hints. She'd always have prayer before meals at the table. She would say things to my dad about how important God was, dropping these little seeds all the time. And it came that when mom and dad had 3 kids, dad got to being concerned, how in the world am I going to help these kids grow up and make good choices when they're gone, and I'm not going to have influence over them? And he got to thinking about the things that my grandmother had been saying, these little things about God, and God could be with you. And he decided, well, I'm going to find out if there's anything to it. And so he did. He started deliberately studying the scriptures, reading Bible stories. He had a Ingermeyer Bible story book that my mom's sister had given to the family, just the stories in story form, and he would read those, ended up reading them to us kids while he was learning. And he, even though he thought he was going to convince himself there wasn't anything to this religious thing in God, he ended up convincing himself the other way around, in the same way with the church. He just wasn't convinced that the church that my mom was a member of too was not what he really would want, but he ended up being convinced of the truth of it. So that started my spiritual journey for sure. So I told you a little bit about my mom's mom, my grandmother. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her. When she was a young woman, she came to Wyoming, to that part of the area, to be a school teacher. She was single, she was young, and so she taught school. She got married to a man by the name of Steve Morris. They had 2 children. And one event, Steve and his friend needed to trail some horses up into Canada. So they were in process of doing that. And one night, he was setting up a tent. It was storming out. The wind was blowing, and it was thunder and lightning, and he was attempting to set up a tent. And the lightning struck the tent pole and killed him. Of course, my grandmother didn't know about it immediately because you didn't have that kind of communication, but eventually she was told. And she had 2 small children, husband was gone, she was on her own. And so, what am I going to do? When during those days, it wasn't as easy to find work, and she had children. So, teaching school was not allowed when you had a family like that. So she ended up, there was this older man who was 20 years older than she was, named John Mahoney, and he needed a housekeeper. So he invited her to come and be his housekeeper. And so she did. Took the 2 children, and she worked for him. Came from, or just what older, but he was a good man, and they ended up being married and had 4 children. So my grandmother had the 2 children, and then they had 3 sons, and my mom was the only girl from that marriage. But my mom would talk about him. He was always old to her, but he was always very kind, and she had a lot of affection for him, a lot of love for him. But he was older, so it made a big difference in how much he could share with them as they were growing up. Well, this was during Depression years. My grandma and grandpa then had a very productive ranch in Wyoming. It was up by the Alva, Wyoming, which probably most of you don't know where that is, but a very small little town close to about 10 miles from Hewlett, Wyoming, which is close to the Devils Tower National Monument. So I'll give you a little location there. So it really a very productive ranch. He was well-to-do, had big Belgian horses, had registered cattle, but it was Depression years, and he owed money on the ranch, and he couldn't pay it. So they ended up losing it. It went back to the bank. And this happened about the time my grandfather died. And so again, my grandmother was on her own. Most of the kids were gone from home, but there was one younger son that was still at home. His name was Ed. My mom and dad had just recently been married to each other, but my grandmother decided she's going to move to Hewlett, and she did that, and she had a little building out next to her house where she boarded people, rented the space for them, and she cooked for them. So room and board, and she would teach piano lessons. She made it that way, but she, again, was a significant person in our lives when it comes to God and the church. Because she, amazing woman, common, ordinary, but amazing. And you've heard Becky talk about her. She was my brother Dan, my oldest sibling. She was the person that had the most influence on him, I think, all his life. She loved him. He was not an easy person. The son, he actually had ADHD. Mom and Dad didn't know that at the time. That's what it was, but he would do things that would drive them crazy. But my grandmother would listen to him. He could talk to her. She loved him, and he knew it. She taught him so much about God, and introduced him to prayer and to all of that. And Dan was very faithful because of her influence. Taught my dad, as I mentioned earlier, dropped those little hints, and it was because of her that he ended up joining the church and making a huge difference in our lives. In the community, she loved everyone. Anyone come to her door, ask for a hand, maybe some money because they were out, she'd give it to them. No matter what, they could decide what they're going to do with it. And my dad thought a lot of times she was not being very wise because they were just going to go to the bar with it. But, she was that kind-hearted, and she was the friend of the people that no one else was a friend to. When she first moved there, we didn't have a reorganized Latter-day Saint church there. She went to the Baptist church and ended up teaching Sunday school in the Baptist church. I mean, she was that kind of person, very active and involved. When I was growing up, I wanted to be like her. And so she was kind of a model for me, and she had a lot of influence, not only on me, but on lots of people. So that's a little bit about my background and history. So you kind of know, where I come from. So Paul says he wants to hear more about my spiritual journey. Well, it just so happens that I was part of the church's spiritual formation program, and we were asked to write our spiritual autobiography. So I've got it. I'm going to try to not just read it. I could read it. I was tempted, but let me just share some with you. One of my first memories of God was when I was a little girl. Mom would have Lucy and I kneel down beside her bed and say, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." I just remember, saying that prayer and then thinking about it afterwards. There's somebody there. I'm praying to God, but I might die before I wake. I don't particularly like that idea, but there's somebody out there, other than just us people here on earth. So it helped me to start understanding that there's something bigger than myself. And on top of that, like I mentioned earlier, every time we go to Grandma's house, she'd always offer prayer over the food before a meal. And I also saw her a lot of times in her little ante room where she had her sewing machine set up with her scriptures out or a study book, and she would study. So if we popped in maybe sometime here, she'd be sitting with her paper and pencil writing answers to questions, but she was doing a study of the scriptures, and we knew that. She used the sewing machine cabinet as her desk. So her house was pretty small. When she prayed, she would pray, "All wise and loving Father." Almost every time I heard her say a prayer, she'd start out, "All wise and loving Father." And so, again, thinking about who's this God that there? And my grandmother was very much involved with this God. She would read us Bible stories as well. There was one book she used to read to us called Stories That Live. Some of you may remember that, but it was real life stories of people who had maybe dangerous experiences or stressful experiences, and they would be sharing their testimony of how God was with them. So those were kind of exciting stories. One I remember was about a boy that about got bit by a snake. Those kind of stories, but he was protected, so all of that. So she would read that and all. So I was just learning, more about this God and building an image in my mind of who God was. Somebody out there, somebody that could be with you, but you couldn't see him. But there was something there about that. But there was something that was even more significant on my journey in understanding God, and that was that when my dad was converted and joined the church, it changed our life. Before that, we never, rarely ever, once in a while, attended church. And they had church in Hewlett, but often it was in my grandmother's house, because we didn't have a church building. Eventually, they got an old schoolhouse, brought it in, a country schoolhouse, set it up, and that's where we ended up having church there. But we lived on a ranch in Wyoming. We lived about 16 miles from town. And so there were days, nights, well, in fact, we never came usually in on Wednesday night, even though they'd have Wednesday night worship at the church. We never usually made it in for that, but the rest of the time we would go in. So, but what we did in place of that on Wednesday nights, Dad would have us all gather in our little cabin. We had a small cabin. There were I didn't say to you, but there were 4 of us siblings. So Dan was the oldest, who was Becky's husband, and then my brother Dave and myself and Lucy, my younger sister. And so Dad would gather us with Mom in our little living room. We had a pot-belly wood stove, had a lamp for several years until my dad and his brother brought in some electric lines and hooked up to electricity. But we'd turn the lights out and kneel down beside our chair, and we'd each take turns saying a prayer. And, Dad's, I've mentioned before, Dad's prayers got kind of long. You're kneeling down there and you're a kid. But at the same time, I thought about it afterwards, and I felt something there in my heart. I felt something warm, and I really liked it. And so I wanted more of it. And Dad would tell us, he said, now you guys, you're learning how to pray here. He said, but you should go pray on your own. Don't just pray, with the family, but, go pray on your own. And so I took him seriously. And Lucy and I, and Dan and Dave both, we had to walk to country school, always uphill both ways. But we did. We lived down in the valley at the ranch, and we had to go up over the rim rocks. So we'd have to climb up and get on top of the rim rocks, and then we walked across pastures, through the fences, climbed through the fences until we got to the schoolhouse. And so Lucy and I, we would often stop on top of the rim rocks before we took off more, and we'd say a prayer, because Dad said, you ought to say prayers, how to pray on your own. So we did that. And in addition, I would sometimes go out and sit up on top of one of those rocks on my own and just offer my prayers, look out over the valley. It was beautiful, beautiful country there. And the ranch, it was about an 860-acre ranch, and a lot of trees, a little creek that ran through it. And just for me, it was the most beautiful place. But I'm getting to know this God better and feeling God's Spirit through that. So all of those things were starting to form me. Look at my notes here. So we eventually, when Dan was old enough for high school, my parents said, what are we going to do? Too far, no buses out there. He could go in and live with Grandma and go to school. They wouldn't see him all week. Maybe he could come back to the ranch on the weekend. But they didn't really want to split the family that way. They wanted to, be there for him. what to do, but Dad loved that ranch. He felt like God gave him that ranch. He just loved it, truly. And my mom, I mean, she was a country girl. But you know what? They decided they were going to move into town, and they bought a little acreage outside of Hewlett, loaded up the bunkhouse. Dad had built a bunkhouse where the boys slept when we got a little bigger, and brought it, pulled it in, and set it up on that property. And then they built rooms on all 4 sides of it. I don't think, it wasn't until we were there after a few years that we ever had an indoor toilet. We were always the outdoor. So, that's where we were in those days. But Dad, had a well dug, so we had water. He brought that water in, which was a blessing, and eventually got the bathroom in there. But I don't think that was even there until after I went to college. So it took a while. But that's where we set up housekeeping, Mom and Dad and all of us, and Dan went to high school there. Dad never sold the ranch. He hoped eventually he'd get back out there. They never did get back out there to live. But they would go out, he and Mom, as often as they could, and he rented it in the land. So it was a place they loved. But to tell you a bit more about Dad, when he was baptized, it wasn't, I don't know, hardly any time at all, and he was ordained to the priesthood, and he was made pastor of the church and became the Lamoni district president. So he took on responsibilities in the church very early after his baptism. So for that reason, his commitment, played out in all of our life events. So a lot of church involvement in that way. So when I was old enough to be baptized, I was actually 9 years old at the time, I really wanted to be baptized. My dad's conversion, I had inside of me this real desire to be baptized. I was so eager, embarrassingly. There were about 8 or 9 of us that were being baptized, and we're at the Alva, Wyoming. It was a community church building, but we used it. Our LDS church used it. But there was a pond up on the hill, and so we all went up to the pond and to get ready for the baptism service. So the minister, Brother Lundeen, walked out into the pond. He was a traveling missionary. He came through there to baptize us, and I followed him. Instead of waiting for him to get out there and turn around and invite us to come, I was so eager. I just followed behind him. I realized later, you were supposed to do that, but at the time, that's what I did. So, I think, though, even more important to me than my water baptism was the confirmation. I can remember I can still see myself sitting there on the chair and promising God. I wanted so much, to be a good disciple. I wanted to be fully committed. And so I had that in my heart, that real deep desire for that. And I don't think it's ever left me. It's that kind of deep down love, a desire, to be that kind of a disciple. So that was another part of my experience, my spiritual journey. Because, yeah.
You started out as a 70 back there then, didn't you?
I don't think so. But because my grandmother did this Bible study, I'd seen her do it, I thought, well, why can't I do that too? So I got her book that she used. It was a Bible study book that had questions in it, and it took you clear through the Bible. So I was probably junior, senior high when I did that. I was relatively young. I got my little, like she did, my little journal, and wrote out the answers to all those questions. So that was a part of that spiritual journey too. I was learning about the scriptures more. And so that was really, a good foundation for me. During those days too, there were, like I say, 7 or 8 of us kids, and we were young that were baptized when I was baptized. So we had a fairly good sized youth group, and so we had Science League. And probably most of you here might have known what Science League was, but it was a youth group. And we, as youth, we were the leaders. There was the 4 commissions, worship and study and recreation, and what was the other one, fellowship. But we all had a role to play in that. And so that was time for developing some leadership skills in this spiritual journey, important part of our lives. My dad and Merlin O'Haver, which was he was the other priesthood member in that area there where we had church, they would be the leaders, and they were very good at encouraging us and helping us have those spiritual events like prayer meetings. So we'd have campfires up on top of the hill. We could look out over the valley and see the Belfish River and the Devil's Tower. And we early morning Easter sunrise services, all those things were nourishing us and helping us become. They were really important to us. Well, and one of the things my dad did on Wednesday night when we were now in town and we had prayer meeting, before we ever went, he'd always say, "Now I sure wish you would offer a prayer or a testimony tonight. It would be great for you to do that." I didn't want to in the worst way, because I was not a really outgoing person. I was, more uncertain of myself, but because my dad said it, I would do it. And afterwards, I'd always feel good about it. So it was always the reward for putting myself out there and having the courage to do, even though I didn't want to. So it was a good thing for a dad to say that. I recall one time coming home in the car. It was just Dad and Dan and I sitting in the car, and Dan he's older than me by 5 years or so. I remember Dan saying to my dad, "I think Lorrie has the gift of love." Well, I never heard that. It was like, I didn't say anything. I just heard him say it. My dad didn't say a whole lot, but it planted a seed in my brain. I wonder if I do. I don't know. But it was there. So again, a piece of that spiritual journey, these little seeds that get planted. Mom and Dad made sure that we went to reunions, our church reunions, regularly, and there we got to meet lots of people from all over the Wyoming district, and youth camps. So that was just part of it. Youth camps were so important to my dad that when my brother Dave was old enough to work, like he's high school age and he was working for a rancher in the area, Dad went to the rancher and said, I'm really glad that you're wanting to hire Dave, but I really would like to ask you to let him off for a week to go to camp. Well, he didn't have any problem letting him take a week off. He was fine with him. Dave probably would have never asked for it, but Dad made sure he went. And it was at that camp that Dave met his future wife, so he never regretted it. But I'm just saying, those experiences, the camping experiences, were important on that spiritual journey. Just, for a lot of different reasons. Other people that I became acquainted with through those experiences, seeing the devotion of the people who gathered together at reunions or camps were all part of that. Really important. Merlin O'Haver, I just mentioned him a minute ago. He was a great minister. He loved the youth. He would always be telling stories, and Marie smiles because she knows who Merlin is too. He would tell us stories. He was always this positive thinking man who had a strong faith, and he was sharing that faith with us. We'd go to camps, he'd be in the car with him, and Merlin would be talking, telling stories, and we'd be listening. And he was in a very important part of my spiritual journey. One time at a prayer meeting, and Lucy and I were there, as we would always, all of us kids would go. Merlin got up under the influence of the Spirit and said that we would be led to our future husbands if we were faithful. Well, that was a pretty important message. I'm still not sure if I was faithful and whether the husbands I was led to were God's choice, but that was, I just remember him saying that, and again making me think about it. I was introduced to music by my grandmother. That's part of my spiritual journey too, was the music. She taught piano lessons. In fact, that's one way she had income. With the kids in town, they would come and she would teach. I took piano lessons too. We didn't pay her for my piano lessons, but for every star I got for a piece well done, I got a penny. And so I was earning money, doing a good job. But what I wanted to do more than anything and practice most were the hymns and the hymnal. I mean, I think I must have been an unusual kid. I don't know, because I was focused on church things like that. So I would learn to play the hymns, and then occasionally I would be able to play for church. My mom played regularly, my grandmother played regularly, and occasionally I would get to play. But it wasn't only the piano lessons. The congregation also at Easter time and often at Christmas would sing cantatas. So, the story of Easter in music. And we would sing energetically, just full voice. And those experiences, again, Alleluia, Alleluia, Christ is born. Those things got inside of me too. It's just the joy of the Easter story, for example, the joy of Christ is risen, kind of whole event was there. My grandmother, again, music. When she died unexpectedly from an accident she wanted the song, the hymn, Lift Your Glad Voices, sung at her funeral. And that's a very positive, the hymn, Lift Your Glad Voices. And that's what we did. We sang that song. So, the influence of music was just there. And it was a positive, not a judgmental kind of music expression, but a very positive, God-loving us and being called that kind of a music event. So I mentioned to you earlier, I always wanted to be like my grandmother. I did. But I also wanted to be like my dad. So I always remember one day walking home in Hewlett, walking home to school. We lived about a mile from town, so we walked back and forth to school, thinking about my dad. Why I admired him so much. I was actually intimidated by him when I was growing up. He was a disciplinarian, and I was not a very, I had a lot of feelings that were close on the surface. And so it was easy for me to cry, kind of thing. My dad, I think, only spanked me once because I was so compliant. Yeah, that once was when we ran away when we weren't supposed to, up to my aunt and uncle's house. Got caught. So Lucy and I got spanked when we got back, and I didn't want to cry, and Lucy says to me, I didn't cry when he spanked me. She said, you gotta cry, or he'll keep spanking you. So he did. He spanked me again, and I cried. My younger sister was my teacher a lot of times. But my dad, back to why I wanted to be like him, because he was honest. He was a caring man. He was a person of integrity. And he was well respected in the community and roundabout. He was the kind of person I wanted to be. Genuinely good person. And always, looking out to want to help other people. In the church, he was forever, involved in actively living his discipleship. It wasn't just something that he did on Sundays. It was his life. His lifestyle. And so I always wanted to be like him. So he was a model for me as well. I love my mom too, but she was more pragmatic. In fact, my mom was the kind of person who said, I wish people would quit saying I love you so much. She said they say it too much, and I don't know if they just overuse that phrase. But she showed her love. When we were growing up, we hardly ever heard I love you from our parents. But we knew that we were loved. I remember going to country school on the ranch, and we had some classmates there who always were talking about their mom and dad as loving and sweetie, using words like that, And we just thought that was sissy stuff. You know? That wasn't, we weren't sissies, you know, like that. So we didn't say those things. We just knew we were loved. So there was that kind of an atmosphere. So it wasn't used often, those words, but the behavior came through as being loving and kind and caring. So it was always very important to us. I ended up, you know, always knew I was going to come to Graceland when I was ready for college. Dan was the first one, came to Graceland. He wanted to come to Graceland more than anything, and he came. Mom and Dad were able to, you know, help him make the financial commitment and came. When it was my turn, I was ready to come as well, but you know, those were the days when they didn't just drive you here and you didn't have a car to drive. So I think I came on either the bus or the train that first time. I think it was the train. There was a train that came through Lamoni during those days. That was 65, 61 when I started Graceland. So I came to Graceland, and again, a part of my spiritual journey was at Graceland. I definitely was homesick, but I never, ever wanted my mom and dad to know it. So we didn't talk on the phone very often. And I was always kind of not wanting to talk on the phone because I was afraid I would cry because I missed them. And I didn't want them to know it. So I'd have to be brave and strong, you know, so they wouldn't know how I was really feeling. But, you know, when I was at Graceland, a friend in Wyoming said before I went, when we were talking about, you know, going to go to Graceland, what's it like there? Because she'd been to Graceland, and she said, you'll get out of it as much as you put into it. And I hung on to that and realized that's really true. You get out of it as much as you put into it. So when I went to Graceland, that was what I was going to do. Going to put into it, because that's where I would, you know, find the experience to be enriching. And that's, you know, kind of how it worked. I ended up being a crescent one year, which some of you probably know what crescents are, and some of you don't, but yeah. So I did that, and I was homecoming queen. I don't know if I can't remember if I was ever homecoming queen. I was just candidate, I think, but I can't remember. You know, and those experiences were really unreal. I mean, it was like I couldn't understand why I would be elected to be homecoming queen. I really didn't. You know, I didn't feel beautiful, and I just didn't see myself that way. So it was always kind of a surprise. Those kind of things were a surprise to me, and very humbling. I didn't make me feel stuck up or anything like that, because it was more of just a I can't believe it kind of experience. It was while there that I asked to get my, at that time, patriarchal blessing. Later they called it evangelist blessing, but Roy Cheville gave me my patriarchal blessing while I was there. And I remember we sat together once before he gave me my blessing. Second time I met with him, I received my blessing, and I still have it. And he said some things in there that has guided my life. It really made it, you know, a positive impact on my life. So again, Graceland experience, important part of my spiritual journey, Paul. So while I was at Graceland, there was a young man who kept pestering me, wanting to date, and so I met Ralph Strait there, and he wanted me to marry him, and I finally said yes, we would be married. And so that was when I was junior at Graceland at the time, and we were married in Wyoming, came out and had a wedding there, and went out to Portland, Oregon area where he originally came from that summer and worked there. He got a job with I can't remember anyway, he got a job. And then later I found a job with a telephone company out there. So met his folks, and his stepmom was a member of the church, of the reorganized Latter-day Saint church still then. So that was a good thing. And Ralph was as well. After all, he was at Graceland, which was one reason I met him there. So we had 3 children, you know, Sally, my oldest, Tim, and Jim. And we were, you know, faithful attenders of church at Andover. And for whatever reason, I'm not sure what happened, but Ralph quit going. And I would ask him about it, and he'd say, oh, every time I go, I get a headache. And I never did really understand, but I missed that a lot. I went with the kids, and and when Ralph and I were married, we lived here in Lamoni, because we were both offered teaching jobs at the school. And so we stayed, in Lamoni and had a home here, not very far from the church. And both of us taught school the first year, and then I got pregnant with Sally, and I dropped out teaching, and Ralph continued. But so I would walk the kids to church, and he would stay home. We were married 7 years, I've stopped to think how it was, and Ralph was killed in an airplane accident. He and his brother Jim were flying back to Washington for their stepmother's funeral, Hazel, who was the one that I met after I married Ralph. And all we know is that they didn't arrive. Lucy was married to Ralph's brother, Jim. And so they were up in Iowa City at that time. I was down here. So we communicated on the phone, and they had never checked in that they arrived. And so we, notified and talked to the airport, and they hadn't heard from them. So they set out a search for them and couldn't find the plane. Lucy came down from Iowa City with Nick. She was about to give birth to their second child, who was born a couple weeks later. And Mom and Dad came out. It was 8 days before they found them. And the plane looked like it had been, the wreck was bad enough, it looked like they had been instantly killed. They were both thrown out of the plane, and their bodies were there. One of them had his neck broken. We don't know which one it was, but it looked like it was instantaneous, which was a real blessing for us, because all we could think of is they might be laying there suffering, and we were so it was almost like a relief and a blessing to hear that they'd actually been killed instantly. But that was again a journey of faith. The community were very supportive. My response to that was that, what, I can think about this in two ways. I can think, God caused this to happen. It was Ralph's time to go, so it was meant to be. Or I could think it was an accident. And I decided, for me, it was an accident. It was poor judgment. Jim was flying, and he didn't have a full-fledged license to fly, but he was given the permission to fly the plane because he was getting those hours. Certified. And so he'd flown enough that he was permitted to take the plane and go. And he was also a risk taker. And what happened apparently was that they think there was a storm squall that came up, and they hit the side of a mountain, and that's the impact is what caused the airplane accident. So for me, it was an accident, poor judgment, or just an accident. Maybe did the very best he could, I'm sure, but they were killed. And so, I told my kids, they were young, 5, 3, and Jim was about 2. And I told them what had happened. They didn't cry. I think Sally understood somewhat, 5 years old. The other 2 were really pretty young. It was later when Sally's little kitten got killed as it was crossing the road that she cried and cried and cried and cried. And I knew part of that was her dad. Just remembering that. But anyway, so we walked through the community's support and time. We were strong, and it was, in my mind, God was very important. God was a strength. God was a foundation. Knowing that God was there was what gave us the courage and the ability to keep going. And keep living life. When had small children, Lucy had 2, I had 3. I kept all 5 children as she went back to work as a nurse. She had her nursing degree. I kept all of the children. We were about all the same age because Lucy's kids were the same age as my 2 younger ones, virtually. And so it was definitely a very busy time. So not much time to grieve. to be honest with you. So Lucy got married a couple years after that accident, remarried to a farmer, Larry Baxter, and he had 2 children already. His wife had died in childbirth, and Lucy happened to be the nurse when she died. So Larry met her for that reason, and eventually came back and started dating her, and they got married. I married again the second time, my marriage the second time, about a year after Lucy remarried to Will Reiser. And he had 2 children. He was divorced, and he had 2 children as well. Well, Will he worked for Pioneer, well, take it back. First, he worked at Graceland. He was a professor at Graceland, and he decided to take a sabbatical. So he went to Des Moines and started working for a Pioneer Hybrid. And I went with him. We, got an apartment up there, and he worked. I worked, a couple of jobs in Des Moines. One, I worked for an ENT, ear, nose, throat specialist, as a receptionist, and I also worked, because of my education background, as an associate behavioral disability school teacher in high school at North High School. But then I decided I wanted to go back to college, so I went to Ames to get my graduate degree, both my master's and my PhD. In the meantime, Will was offered to go to France with Pioneer Hybrid. It was an awesome opportunity, so we both agreed he'd go. I stayed because I was still attending classes and getting my graduate degree. And so, and Will, he met a woman there, a French woman, and wrote these glowing letters back about what a beautiful person she was, and how much he was enjoying her, and I could feel what was happening. And he would come back and visit to Iowa occasionally. I mean, not very often, because France is away, and so, but he'd fly back a few times, and he would talk about her. I thought, well, when I get out of school, I'll go there, and we'll get it worked out. So that's when I graduated, I went to France and was there for a year, and did lots and lots of praying. We did a lot of talking. I really liked Francois, who's the woman that Will was attracted to. I have nothing ever against her. A beautiful person. I liked her personality, all of it. But finally came to the conclusion, I can't stay married and respect myself. So I said, I told Will, I said, you need to make your decision, and I'll make my decision. I'm not going to pressure you, by my decision, but you just need to decide where you're going with this. And if you want to keep that relationship going. And I finally said, I'm just not going to continue. And so we ended up getting a divorce, an amicable divorce, but definitely a difficult time in my life. So one of those challenges that these questions talk about, I prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed, and finally I came to the conclusion, no matter which way you choose, God will be with you. And that just, a lot of it took a lot of pressure off my shoulders. It was like, okay, I can make the decision I think is best, and it's going to be all right. And so that's what I made that decision. That's what I'm going to do. And honestly, God has been with me every step of the way. Not that it's easy to adjust and adapt, but I know more about somebody who's lost a husband by death than somebody who's lost a spouse by divorce. I have much more empathy for people in general because of going through those experiences. And not fun experiences, but definitely, God blessed kind of experiences, because that's where my strength came from, was from God. So when I talk to people who are questioning if there is a God, or what they're feeling all and thither as to what to do about their life, I say, for me, I tell them, God is my foundation. I said and I see God as a God of love, not a God of judgment. And you hear me talk about that a lot, I know, but I really do. For me, God is a God of love, and always inviting us always, never, ever stop inviting us to come. In fact, I have this strange idea that when you die, no matter what you've done on earth, you might be a murderer, as soon as you die and go to heaven, God's going to make you whole. All those things that happened that created those poor choices and decisions when you were on earth, you get back to heaven, God's going to say, welcome home, I love you. Because isn't that the power of love makes us whole? And so I know not very many people would agree with me, but
Amen.
Straight feeling. Anyway, I have had a lot of experiences that helped keep me humble too. I mean, a lot of the divorce and all of that, those are humbling experiences. They're never experiences to feel proud about. And when I play the organ and make mistakes, every time I do, it keeps me humble. I just say, God knows how to keep me humble. So I'm definitely helps a lot. But in essence, I don't think my commitment from the day I was confirmed after baptism has ever, it's never stopped. It's just there. In fact, I just get more and more convinced that the way of God is the only way. It's the only way to change the world, is to live by those principles that God has established on this earth. And it's when we understand those principles and start living by them and not just talking about them. When I get asked to speak up front, it's like, it's so easy to talk about what you believe in. The hard part is doing what you say. You say you believe it, okay, you better show it. And so for me, that's a lot of the message of Jesus came. He just came to show us how to live the ways of God, how to live those principles of love and faith and use repentance and forgiveness. They're there. They're part of the tools we have to work with. Being honest, all of those basic principles, the worth of all persons, all of that. Blessings of community, learning how to live together in relationship. That's what Jesus was all about. So for me, that's what life on this earth, it's a gift. I say life on earth is a gift, and it's relatively short. So we want to make the most of it every day. When I get aches and pains, I say, well, that's just part of earth life. If you like being on earth, that's part of earth life. So quit complaining. It's a gift. So I'll give you 3 minutes to ask questions.
Your dad wrote a lot of stories.
Yeah.
Her dad wrote a lot of stories, and I was in church with him for a year or two, and he gave me some of his stories to read, and they were great stories.
When you were talking about Devil's Tower and that area, my mind immediately goes to the Native Americans there. Did your family have, or your dad have interactions with Native Americans that are of particular interest, stories or whatever?
He doesn't. I don't recall that. I know Becky and Dan lived on the reservation and taught school there for a number of years. Yeah, so Chinle, Arizona. Wyoming, I don't recall of being strong Native American population, like reservation kind of things there in Wyoming. But, for sure, the Native American culture has a lot of impact on my life, because I've read books, and I really think that if we'd have paid attention to them when we colonized the United States, this country, we would be much better off than we are today. We did disservice to them.
Lorrie, this is done on Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned that you were baptized by Brother Lundeen, and I've I was baptized by him also. Uh,
Yeah, that's neat.
yeah, what was his? Because he brought my family into the church. He
Oh, that is
was my
neat.
dad's supervisor at the shipyards at Bremerton, Washington. Now, how is his relationship with you in Wyoming? How did that work?
Well, he was a missionary. I mean, he came through there as a traveling missionary. So
Oh, I
was he
see.
at 70? I can't remember just his priesthood, but he was there as the part of the World Church employment.
Oh, I see. Because uh, I said we were brought into the church by Adolf Lundin, who was my dad's supervisor at the shipyards in Bremerton, Washington.
Yeah.
That was uh, that was before he went under church appointment.
I don't know, but yeah, it could be. That could have been, Don. I'm not sure, just the time frame there, but that's how I knew him, was
I
through
see.
being.
Well,
Yeah.
I was curious about that.
I've got a couple of questions and an observation. I was really moved by the fact that your father loved his ranch. Mom did too. And said, Dan, you got to go to high school. Let's get closer to town. If I want to have an image in my head of what your father looked like and sounded like and talked like and acted like, can I think about how I knew Dan Long a little bit? Would Dan Long be the spitting image?
No, he really wouldn't. I mean, Dan was very unlike my dad. And Dave, my brother Dave, was much more like my dad. Dan was not a mechanical, hands-on, do-it kind of person, which my dad really was. In fact, Dad didn't understand Dan very well. That's why grandmother was such an important part in Dan's life. He and Dad would butt heads. I mean, because Dan was very different. I think the commitment was similar. I mean, Dan's commitment was strong, just like my dad's was, but their personalities was quite different.
The old saying, they don't make them like that anymore. Is there a chance, your opinion, as we debate and we struggle in 2024, that our children are no longer interested in church, at least the traditional experience? Is there a chance that your father represents a dying breed in this country of men connected to a strong woman who said to their kids, we're going to do this? As I look at my family, can I do some looking in the mirror and think, maybe if I had been more like Laurie's dad? You know, is that a missing element in our society now?
I mean, it's possible that that may be part of it. I don't know for sure. I think it's the cultural changes that affected a lot of how our youth today respond. And I don't think they dislike being spiritually alive, you know, knowing God that way. But I think it's more the organization of the church that's troubling to them. It's a denominational organization where I think today's world, there's more people that are saying those things have divided this in a lot of ways. We have how many different denominations meeting this Sunday morning? I mean, all in our different places because we've divided ourselves. The institution, I believe this, so I'm going to go to that church, you know, whereas I think a lot of today's culture are looking at following the ways of God, the Bible. In fact, I talked to my nephew just a couple of days ago. He believes that if we don't need all the denominations. If we would follow what the Bible teaches, then we'll do fine. We'll do well. So I think our kids still have a lot of desire to have the relationship, but maybe not necessarily to attend a church denomination. And I think more than anything, when you love your kids, that's the greatest gift you give them. So you've given your kids a huge gift by caring for them like you do. Paul, your family impresses me, and I think that's true of other families. It's the love that you have for them, and they know it, and that affects and influences them. And different culture today than when my dad and we were growing up, because yeah, the man was more the authoritarian then. But still, it's the love that has the most power in how kids are formed.
Quickly, I didn't know you had a PhD. Talk about what that was in, and then, my gosh, your husband is killed in a plane crash. Lucy came and you teamed up and you had the 5 children. How overwhelmed were you?
Here's how overwhelmed I was. One day, I found myself in the dentist's office, and I do not like to go to the dentist's office. It was like, oh, I can relax. I don't have kids. That's what it was like. A good example. That was funny. So what was the first question?
Your degree.
Oh, yeah. No, I did. I got a PhD in Human Development and Family Studies with a minor in gerontology. So I have an elementary education undergraduate degree, a gerontology minor in my graduate degree. So I say I've got the whole life. The Human Development Family Studies is almost a mixture between sociology and psychology. A great major to have, but I learned a lot from it.
I remember when Ralph was killed, I was in grade school, and it was a shock. Because kids, just aren't used to the idea you could be there and gone the next day. And I remember it really upset a lot of kids in the school. I was very close to your husband, so that was a shocking thing.
Yeah. So, Ralph taught physical education in the school. So he taught, I don't know how many years at Lamoni, but probably 6 or 7, I'm guessing.
Okay, well, how about a round of applause?